So the question is for you, what do markets think about the efforts of the Ukrainian government to reform the country? Do we see that in the markets? And people have touched upon this question in multiple ways. But I would like to ask a more specific question, if you can make any argument to that extent. Do markets respond differently to the government behavior prior and after 2013 and 2014?
It's a good question. Let's start with where Ukrainian debt is priced right now. It's actually is one of the highest yielding debt in the emerging markets. In the age where most of the government bonds are yielding negative or close to zero, Ukraine quasi-sovereign debt is yielding double digits. Let's look at the Ukrainian railways. I think it trades at 11% yield as we speak. So why do markets give so low credit to very remarkable achievements that Ukraine had done? And let's just dwell a little bit. I mean, a lot had been said about those achievements, but let's just look where we were just a few years ago. Basically, Ukraine had double deficits. It had huge reliance on imports of Russian gas. It had totally unstable macroeconomic trajectory. It had one of the worst banking systems in emerging markets, and arguably one of the worst central banks that was presiding over that banking system. I think what has been achieved in the last 2 years in terms of macro stability is tremendous. I think it's one of the, I've been following Ukraine for 16 years and emerging markets for 16 years, and I think rarely have I seen a country coming from so disadvantageous position achieving so much in terms of market stability so quickly. Well, I think, first of all, markets do continue to see risks in terms of market stability, and let's not be complacent here. The risks are Ukraine had done the debt restructuring, but continues to be a relatively highly indebted country. Debt to GDP stands at around 80%. And that obviously is a risk for the markets, and to a large extent, Ukraine needs to grow to reduce that risk, and so the growth should come. Then secondly, if you look at the banking system, a lot has been done. Over the last 2 years, I believe 33% of the assets in Ukrainian banking system were triaged by the NBU, and that's enormous achievement. But as I said, the banking system was one of the worst in the emerging markets, so there is a lot that needs to be done, and Valeria Gontreva and other speakers had mentioned that, and you need to strengthen banking regulation further. You need reforms in terms of corporate bankruptcy. You need to overall reduce the amount of NPLs in the system, which is still is significant. So markets price in those risks. Those are significant risks. And then we come to the subject of structural reform. And if you look there, there seems to be a lot of complacency and very little progress achieved this year. Before coming to this conference, I called a few friends. So I called a few friends who were the reformists in the government and asked them, what are the biggest issues, what needs to be done? And everyone told, and this is what people told me. You see, we are like a guerrilla band deep behind the enemy lines, and we're totally surrounded, we're fighting on all fronts. We badly need judiciary reform because without we can't do reforms where every single step is being challenged by corrupt courts. Then we we badly need some sort of support from the government, because sometimes we just feel abandoned, right? We need to say, that's what people told me, we need to hire talented people in our ministries, but we can't pay them salaries because we do not get funding for that. So how we talk about privatization, we talk about structural reforms, but who is going to implement the laws which are being adopted by the Rada? So all of that is concerning, and all of that was an issue last year and continues to be an issue this year. Then I called some friends in the banking sector and asked them, well, what do you need in order to restart lending? And people told me the same things that we've been told here on the stage. We need better judiciary, we need better courts, we need better laws, we need restructuring of NPLs. I called people from the business side, and they need, well, not surprisingly, they need better property protection rights. They need a lot of people mentioned land reform, so people are really looking forward towards land reform, and that's an issue that has been discussed for 20 years, and so far.
And it's going to be continued to be discussed.
And so far, yeah, it's just being discussed. People need cheap credit, and for that, we come back to the issue of banking reform. So, well, the markets see all of that, and that's why the debt is priced where it is priced. Now, if I would add something from myself when I follow news from Ukraine, you know, sometimes what I'm really looking in those news is to see a bit more of law and order. And now law and order is a very popular topic in the US elections right now, but by law and order in Ukraine, I probably mean slightly different things. Let's say after Klitschko brothers quit boxing, the heavyweight boxing had become rather boring, but you know, you can always rely on a fight in the Rada for entertainment. And you know, look, all of that is being priced by markets, really, when you look at that. When they see public conflict between two different branches of the government that in theory report to the same government, when they see all of that in the news, when they see another fight in the Rada, another corruption scandal, all of that is being priced by markets. But perhaps that actually is a good thing, because I think well, first of all, it allows investors like me to achieve superior returns in Ukraine when you have the paper here yielding higher. But I think one of the things I'm really worried is if you look at the past of what happened in Ukraine, you had periods of fairly high growth, which were punctuated by tremendous drawdowns. Ukraine was the worst performer in 2008. The GDP contracted by 22%. In 2014, it contracted by 18%. And to me, the stability of the emerging markets is measured by how they perform in the troughs, not how they perform on the when everything is going good for them. So I would actually be very worried if I would see yields on the Ukrainian bonds drop right now, because that, for me, would mean that everyone's becoming complacent. The markets are becoming complacent. Ukraine would be able to borrow again, and to. I'm very worried when people talk about larger budget deficit in Ukraine, because I don't really see why Ukraine needs larger budget deficit right now. I mean, I think the growth should come from the private investment and not from the government investment. And so I actually think that the way the markets view Ukraine, where they price the debt, where it's just a bit too expensive for the government and for government-owned corporations, or in general for corporations from Ukraine to borrow is probably right, and I would be worried if right now we move to a different territory.